In this video, I'm going to be talking about a few plants that go really well with aggressive fish and digging fish like cichlids, big plecos, and goldfish. First two are Anubias and Java fern. These are really great because they grow in rocks and like crevices and stuff, so it's going to be very hard for them to dig up. And because they both have very big and wide leaves, they can't just pluck off little leaves. It'll take a lot more effort to rip the leaves off. And the Anubias has very thick leaves. Like really thick leaves, so it's going to be very, very hard for them to tear like the leaves. They might be able to rip a few off, but it's going to be really hard to do that, and tearing the leaves is just going to be impossible. Well, tearing the leaves is going to be very hard unless you have something like a giant flower horn or something. Whilst the Java fern does have big leaves, it's not actually as thick, so it's much easier to rip, and they also, the leaves like bruise more, and sometimes they don't look as good, but they're very hardy and very like tear resistant and stuff. So they are a little less tear resistant than the Anubias, but they're still really good for plant tanks with cichlids and stuff. Crypts and swords are good as well. Crypts are going to have long leaves and they're going to be a lot more tear resistant than a lot of other plants. And their roots are going to grow outwards a lot and shoot up little runners from there. So once they have their roots in the substrate, it's going to be really hard to pull up, as well as most other plants. But because they are not a big stem, it's a lot harder to rip in half, rip apart. They're like a little plant, they just shoot the little leaves out from the ground rather than growing up big stem and shooting leaves out from there. That's one of the big parts of like not being able to tear it apart. And the Amazon swords have very big thick leaves, not as thick as Anubias, probably around the same as Java fern, but their leaves are big, hard to rip off. They're fairly tear resistant, and once they have roots in the ground, they are hard to rip up. And they're also going to grow fairly big, so smaller fish are going to find it a lot harder to rip it up. Sometimes it depends on the size of fish you're going to get. Most fish are going to go fairly well with those two. Just make sure things like bristlenoses, sometimes they will try and eat it, like the Amazon swords. I've heard stories of them eating them. But I wouldn't worry too much about that. Mine don't, well, when I did have one, it's gone now, but mine never tore it up. I haven't seen other plecos do it. I've seen other videos where the bristlenoses have eaten it, but I wouldn't worry too much about that. Now, some of the plants I would not recommend for these big fish that you don't want to destroy are things like floating plants. So that's like water lettuce, duckweed, frog bit, red root floaters. Floating plants, they're going to find a lot easier to just tear apart, bring down. They don't have to uproot it at all. And other smaller ones, they can just eat and swallow. And sometimes it can be a choking hazard too. I've seen videos of fish choking on them, and they will go up and they get stuck in their throats. You have to pull it out with tweezers. Sometimes they even die and just choke to death. So that is like, I don't recommend adding them. Sometimes you can add big water lettuce. That will be a lot harder to rip apart. But, as I said before, it's very easy to destroy floating plants. Mosses I also wouldn't recommend because they're so soft and delicate. You can easily rip them to shreds. You can easily pull them off things because they do stick to wood and stuff, but they will easily rip off. And because they're so delicate, you can just shred it to pieces and eat it too. Some fish like to eat it. So plants like hornwort, water sprite, wisteria, anything that has a big stem and little flimsy leaves on it are very easy to snap in half and rip apart, pull leaves off, uproot sometimes, depends on the root system. But I also don't think you'd have much success growing a plant at the top of the tank, like growing all sorts of like ivies, vegetables, those sort of things growing at the top of the tank with these fish, because their roots are often very delicate, and you know, roots that are just easy to pull apart, so they can pull that apart very easily and then the plant can't grow properly. But you can have like little mini tubs in the water, so you can grow it up the top and the fish won't actually be able to get to the plant. So you can buy those. I don't know what they're called, I don't use any, but you can buy them all sorts of places. You can make your own DIY ones. In this tank I have a plant, it's out of frame right now, growing out of it. It's a type of ivy. I'll flash it up here if I can remember it, because it actually has thick roots, like fairly thick roots, that my bristlenoses haven't been able to tear into. That's my little list of plants to keep and not to keep with these big fish. I reckon it's fairly important that you do have plants in a fish tank because plants are very beneficial. You're going to find them basically everywhere in every natural river, even in places with cichlids that like to rip things up. They're still going to be there. It's just the fact that the tank is so small, the plants are just everywhere in that one tank, that it's easy to rip them up. Whilst in the wild, there's plants everywhere, scattered around everywhere, where they're not just going to constantly meet up with one, rip it up, and even if they were to rip up every single plant that they find, there's still going to be heaps more in that river. If you got something out of this video, please consider liking or subscribing, and I'll see you guys in the next video.